Opened in 1884, Angelus-Rosedale Cemetery was designed in the monument park style, featuring carefully landscaped grounds and shaded walkways. Here stand some of the finest examples of funerary artwork and architecture. Its founders also saw the change in ideas about body disposal and built on site the second crematory in the United States. Angelus-Rosedale was one of the first cemeteries in the city to open its gates to all, despite race or religion. Over time, it became LA's preferred burial ground for rich and poor, famous and anonymous. We will meet pioneers, politicians, reformers, captains of industry, soldiers, athletes, movie stars, and one real-life monster. Some you will know, some you have probably never heard of. Together we will bring them back to life through their stories. So come walk with me in the first in a series of videos about Angelus-Rosedale, LA's first modern cemetery. Headstones and monuments in all shapes can be found at Rosedale. Most reflect the styles that were in fashion at the time they were erected. Some were completely unique, like this stone carved with a Christian symbol of the cross. Then there's this petrified log. The nameplate to tell us who's buried here is missing. A lot of them were mass-produced and sold by Sears and Roebuck. Others were custom designs chosen to reflect the life and occupation of the deceased. Take, for instance, the headstone for blacksmith John Wilson. His stone was carved into the shape of an anvil with a hammer and chisel on top, but they might represent more than just the tools of his trade. When his wife died in 1893, she apparently cut him out of her will. John spent the next 3 years in court to get control of the $250,000 estate. Eventually he won the case, but sadly died before receiving any money. So perhaps the anvil represents John Wilson's determination to fight for what was his. William Grosser was a quiet, unassuming man who made the study of the heavens his lifelong pursuit. When the old astronomer passed away, he requested to be buried dressed in the suit he wore at his wedding. Celestial objects were etched into the granite orb above his monument as a symbol of his profession. Easily one of the most photographed monuments at Rosedale is this statue of a kneeling woman in an attitude of mourning. Her hand is holding an open scroll inscribed with the names of California pioneer Albert Kercheval, his wife Sarah, and their son Leland. Albert settled in the gold fields of Northern California in 1849. Later he moved to Los Angeles and became a citrus farmer. He was also considered a poet of note and published several volumes of his writing. A scene of a cabin in the mountains with the word peace carved above the door graces the top of Wilhelm Hielscher's headstone. Records show that he was an expressman for the railroad and had no known family. There's no way to know if the cabin was of any significance, but one might imagine that it was a place he saw during his travels and always wanted to get back to. Stone urns are fairly common sights in cemeteries, but in the case of one baseball legend buried at Rosedale, it just as easily could be a trophy cup. As player-manager of the Chicago Cubs, Frank Leroy Chance was given the well-earned nickname Peerless Leader. During the 1906 season, he helped the team set a record of 116 wins, a feat that wouldn't be matched until the 2001 Seattle Mariners. He helmed the team to 4 pennants in 5 years, as well as back-to-back World Series wins in 1907 and 8. The Cubs would not win another series for 108 years. Chance might be considered one of the finest first basemen to play the game, if it weren't for another distinction. With shortstop Joe Tinker and second baseman Johnny Evers, Chance formed the legendary Three Knights of the double play. Their prowess was immortalized in verse after they ended the New York Giants' pennant chances in 1910. Called Baseball's Sad Lexicon, it was written by Franklin Pierce Adams and goes like this. These are the saddest of possible words, Tinker to Evers to Chance. A trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds, Tinker to Evers to Chance. Ruthlessly pricking our Gonfalon bubble, making the Giants hit into a double, words that are heavy with nothing but trouble, Tinker to Evers to Chance. Despite their harmony on the field, the 3 ball players weren't all that friendly off of it. A pregame argument in 1905 between Joe Tinker and Johnny Evers ended in an all-out brawl. As a result, they didn't speak to each other for years. Chance was also known for his temper. In the 1910 series, he became the first player to be ejected from a game for arguing with the umpire. After 14 years, the Cubs lost their peerless leader in 1912. In 1913 and 14, Chance managed the New York Yankees. From there, he managed in the Pacific Coast League before retiring due to failing health. Frank Chance died in 1924 at age 48. 22 years later, he, along with Joe Tinker and Johnny Evers, were inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Long Island City, New York. Here we go into round 4. The scheduled 15-round title bout between welterweight champion Barney Ross and Henry Armstrong. Hurricane Hank.
In 1931, boxer Henry Armstrong began a historic career in the ring that would see him ranked as one of the greatest fighters of all time. Born Henry Jackson Jr. in Columbus, Mississippi, he was the 11th of 15 children. After the death of his mother, he was raised by his grandmother in St. Louis, Missouri. It was there, after graduating high school, that he turned to boxing. Taking the name Armstrong, he began his history-making run in October 1937. With the 6th-round knockout of Petey Sarin, he won the featherweight crown. In May 1938, he beat Barney Ross in a 15-round decision to take the welterweight title. Then in August, he edged Lou Ambers to win another 15-round decision, becoming the lightweight champion. The win made him the first boxer to hold 3 titles simultaneously. Capitalizing on his sudden notoriety, Armstrong briefly turned to acting. He appeared as the lead in the 1939 independent film Keep Punching.
I want to make a promise. I'll never leave you again. No, never.
By March 1940, Armstrong was back in the ring, challenging Severino Garcia for the middleweight crown and a possible 4th Division championship. Throughout, he fought true to form, but the bout ended in a draw, allowing Garcia to keep his title. After successfully defending his welterweight crown 19 times, he finally lost it to Fritzy Zivik in October 1940. Henry continued fighting for another 5 years, but never held another title. By retirement, the former champ had fallen on hard times. Nearly penniless, he began the most difficult fight of his life with alcoholism. But by 1951, he managed to put his demons behind him and became a Baptist minister. Hammerin' Henry Armstrong passed away in 1988. Winning 151 out of 181 career bouts, the champ was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. Caroline Seymour Severance was born in 1820 and raised by the standards of the era that expected little more from women than to marry, be obedient, and have babies. When she married banker T.C. Severance at age 20, her life might have gone in that direction. However, it turned out to be anything but conventional. With her husband's encouragement, Caroline evolved into a social activist. When the couple and their growing family moved to Boston in 1855, she joined in the abolition movement as well as women's rights organizations. Her work led to involvement in women's suffrage and brought her into the company of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Caroline Severance also founded the New England Women's Club that would be the first of many such institutions. It was her belief that clubs would bring about social reform by encouraging women to step into the public arena. In 1875, the Severances moved to Los Angeles and purchased a home that would become a meeting place for progressive thinkers. In addition to her suffrage work, she organized societies for orphans and homeless women. She also established the Los Angeles Public Library and the city's first women's club. When California granted women the vote in 1911, Madam Caroline Severance was the first to register. The following year, she cast her ballot for Theodore Roosevelt as president. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, guaranteeing the right to vote to all American citizens, regardless of gender or race. Caroline Severance did not live to see it happen, but her spirit, along with so many courageous others, lives on in every vote cast from that day to this. Today, the headstone of the so-called Mother of Clubs is marked with "I voted" stickers, placed there by people as a testament that her work was not in vain. Jessie Benton Fremont was the wife and advisor of famed Western explorer, soldier, politician, and California pioneer John C. Fremont, and was indirectly involved in many of the nation's defining events of the 19th century. She was also a noted writer and historian. Jessie was the daughter of powerful Missouri Senator and Congressman Thomas Hart Benton, who championed the territorial expansion of the United States through manifest destiny. Against his wishes, she married Army explorer John Fremont in 1841. In 1850, she made the arduous journey to join her husband in California, where he briefly held the post of military governor. After taking part in drafting the state constitution, he was appointed as one of the new state's first 2 senators. Because of her upbringing, Jessie was remarkably well informed on the issues of the day, and was a strong influence on her husband's politics. Being a firm abolitionist, Fremont was nominated as the first Republican presidential candidate in 1856. Nicknamed the Pathfinder after the popular novel by James Fenimore Cooper, he was presented as a youthful alternative to his elderly rivals, and Jessie added charm and intelligence to her husband's candidacy in much the same way that Jackie Kennedy did a century later. Fremont carried 11 northern states in the election. However, he lost the presidency to Democrat James Buchanan. At the start of the Civil War, Fremont was put in charge of the Department of the West. Headquartered in Missouri, he made 2 crucial decisions. First, he recognized Ulysses S. Grant's military brilliance and promoted him to command. And second, he unilaterally freed all slaves within his jurisdiction. The latter decision resulted in his dismissal for insubordination. Jessie traveled to Washington to plead with President Lincoln on her husband's behalf, but was unable to save his appointment. He resigned from military service in 1864. After the Fremonts lost their fortune in the financial panic of 1873, Jessie took to writing to support their family. Chronicling her husband's exploits as well as her own, Jessie's works are considered historically significant documents of California during the Gold Rush period. Following her husband's death in 1890, Jessie moved to a cottage on 28th Street in Los Angeles, where she continued to write and receive guests. One was President William McKinley, who visited in 1901. When Jessie Benton Fremont died on December 27, 1902, throngs of friends and dignitaries came to say farewell to the Pathfinder's wife. Her body was cremated and the ashes inurned at Rosedale. Andrew and William Glassell were born on a Virginia plantation, but went off on very different paths. Andrew went into the law, and William entered the United States Navy. During the Gold Rush, Andrew settled in San Francisco, where he practiced law and was later appointed as a United States Attorney in Sacramento. At the start of the Civil War, all lawyers in California were made to take loyalty oaths to the Union. Andrew refused and was disbarred. At the same time, William was serving aboard the USS Hartford during her tour of Southeast Asia. Upon the ship's return to Philadelphia in December 1861, William, like his brother, would not swear allegiance to the Union. He was dishonorably discharged from the Navy and sent to a military prison. With his law practice closed, Andrew moved to Santa Cruz, California, where he operated a lumber mill for the duration of the war. In 1862, William was freed in a prisoner exchange. Joining the Confederate Navy as a commissioned officer, he was given the dangerous assignment of breaking the Union blockade in Charleston Harbor. In October 1863, Glassell, with a crew of 3 men, was in command of the torpedo boat CSS David when it attacked the pride of the U.S. Navy, the New Ironsides. The David rammed a spar torpedo into the ironclad's hull below the waterline. The resulting blast washed William and 2 of his men from their craft, and they were captured once they reached shore. Because of the attack, the New Ironsides was taken out of commission for nearly a year. After the war, Andrew moved to Los Angeles, and having his law license restored, formed a partnership with two other men, with their specialty being real estate law. Taking most of their compensation in land, the partners acquired huge amounts of property. When they acquired the Richland Farm Tract, Andrew's brother and Confederate naval hero William was hired to survey lots and to plot the site of a new town that would become the city of Orange, California. William's health was in serious decline from the time he spent in a Union prison. He passed away from tuberculosis on January 28, 1876, at the age of 45. He was never married and had no children. Andrew went on to become the first president of the Los Angeles County Bar Association. One of his last real estate acquisitions was this large family plot at Rosedale. Today he rests with his father, brother, 2 spouses, 9 children, some grandchildren, as well as several in-laws. It seems that in most great families there is a prodigal son. In the Glassell family it was Philip, the 7th of Andrew's 9 children. He seemingly had no interest in his father's business, preferring instead to lead a life of reckless self-indulgence. Philip's amorous appetites led him to Rhoda Edo, a girl 15 years his junior. The two met when she was 17, and he wooed her with the promise of marriage. They lived together as lovers in a rented room for over a year, but it came to a sudden end with the death of his father in January 1901. Within a few weeks, Philip left Rhoda with the promise that he would return. When he didn't, the broken-hearted teenager tracked him down at the home of his brother-in-law, Dr. James DeBarth Shorb. Rhoda shadowed the house for days, trying to see her lover. Finally, after being refused for the last time, and while standing on the front porch of the Shorb house, she put a revolver to her head and pulled the trigger. The next day, the Los Angeles Herald published the letter she wrote to her beloved.
Dear sweetheart Philip, I will do as you have heard. You asked me to pray for you, that you would get back that night. And this is the way you came back. Well, dear, I hope we will meet at home or hell. Which it is, I don't know, but it sure cannot be worse, dear. I love you, and I cannot live without you. Please see that my body gets into the ground. As ever, your wife, as you must always call me. Signed, Mrs. P.H. Glassell. Goodbye, dear.
Rhoda did find her way into the ground here in Rosedale, although her grave is unmarked. Philip would go on battling his personal demons until his own death came 6 years later. There is a curious thing happening at his grave that, when you consider the Edo tragedy, seems almost by design. The roots of a nearby ash tree have entwined Philip's headstone in a permanent embrace, as if, by extension, they are the arms of his spurned lover. It is worth noting that many who are buried at Rosedale are in unmarked graves. While it might be suspected that it was due to their economic status, that is not always the case. Some ended up that way not by chance, but by choice. In fact, several Hollywood legends are buried anonymously somewhere in this veritable sea of monuments. One of these is actor Louis Stone, He is best remembered for the role of Judge James Hardy in the popular Andy Hardy series produced at MGM and starring Andy Rooney. Lewis's portrayal as Andy's patient and wise father became the standard by which other actors in fatherly roles would be measured. Before appearing in over 150 films, Stone served in the cavalry during the Spanish-American War and was an instructor during World War I. Some of his notable films were The Prisoner of Zenda and Scaramouche. He also made an appearance in the 1952 remakes of both pictures. In 1929, Stone was nominated for a Best Actor award for his part in Ernst Lubitsch's The Patriot. Stone's life and career came to an end on the evening of September 12, 1953. While at home, he confronted 3 teenagers who were trespassing on his property, and in so doing, suffered a fatal heart attack. After a private funeral in his home, the veteran actor of both stage and screen was laid to rest at Rosedale. The location of his grave is both unmarked and unknown. By the time he toured America with Fred Carnot's vaudeville troupe, Scottish-born actor Eric Campbell had spent most of his life in front of an audience. While in New York in 1915, he was hired by another Carnot alumnus, Charlie Chaplin, to come to Hollywood and make movies. Campbell's large size and imposing mannerisms were a perfect contrast to Chaplin's jovial little tramp. Between 1916 and 1917, he was featured in nearly a dozen films opposite Chaplin. Despite his brutish characterizations, offstage Campbell was a gentle and kind man who was well liked. 1917 was a troubled year for the actor. In July, his wife of 16 years died suddenly of a heart attack. The following day, his young daughter was injured when the car in which she was riding was struck by a streetcar. In September, he met a young actress at a party, and they were married 5 days later. Within 2 months, his second wife filed for divorce. On December 20th, Campbell was driving home after a night of heavy drinking and was killed in a traffic accident. Campbell's remains were cremated and kept at a local mortuary where they sat unclaimed for years. Then sometime during the 1950s, the ashes were buried at Rosedale, although the location was not recorded. In recent years, a cenotaph was placed here to honor the memory of a big man who still brings laughter to a world he left far too soon. Another whose ashes rest anonymously beneath this dry earth was a revolutionary in the field of medicine, and who played a role in the most infamous shootout in the history of the Old West. George Emery Goodfellow was anything but a typical country doctor. In 1880, he moved to the silver mining town of Tombstone, Arizona. Taking an office on the second floor of the Crystal Palace Saloon, he began a medical practice that lasted 11 years. On October 26, 1881, Virgil, Morgan, and Wyatt Earp, with Doc Holliday, faced Tom and Frank McClowry, Billy and Ike Clanton, and Billy Claiborne in what became known as the gunfight at the OK Corral. After a 30-second exchange of gunfire, Tom and Frank McClowry and Billy Clanton were dead. The wounded Virgil and Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday were treated by Dr. Goodfellow. His testimony during the resulting murder trial of the Earps and Doc Holliday led to their acquittal. At a time when gunmen shot for the belly because it spelled certain death, Dr. Goodfellow was a pioneer in the surgical treatment of such wounds. That, plus his adherence to sterilized operating conditions, saved many lives that normally would have been given up for dead. In addition to being the world's leading authority on gunshot wounds, Goodfellow performed the first perineal prostatectomy and developed an effective spinal anesthetic. Also, after observing the bullet-stopping properties of layered silk fabric, he conceived the development of the lightweight bulletproof vest. After undertaking humanitarian efforts for people affected by the 1887 Sonoran earthquake, Dr. Goodfellow began a study of the quake's effects and created the first surface rupture map in North America. His findings were lauded as a pioneering achievement. By 1910, Dr. Goodfellow was in failing health. He moved to Los Angeles to be with his daughter, and it was there on December 7th he died, 2 weeks short of his 55th birthday. His body was cremated and interred at Rosedale. Although the location of his grave is unknown, many of his surgical methods are still in use today and stand as his lasting memorial. These were but 3 examples of the many unmarked graves at Rosedale. So if ever you should walk here, please tread lightly, even over the bare spots of ground. There is perhaps no place on earth that holds its secrets better than a cemetery. The rusted iron gates and rigid stone walls do not betray the silent sleepers in their tombs. If there was anyone who knew all of Rosedale's secrets, it was John Vanderloo. With a background in agricultural sciences, he came to Los Angeles from Germany in 1883 and put his knowledge to work at the city's newest cemetery. As Rosedale's first superintendent, Vanderloo lived on site from the day that the very first grave was dug until his own body was lowered into the ground 44 years later. During his tenure, he oversaw the construction of every mausoleum and monument, great and small, and he knew personally many of the individuals who now reside within them. One such acquaintance was Abel Crawford, a widower with no friends or family. He was a loner by choice who lived humbly and quietly, and by all accounts saved every dime he earned for one thing only, his death. In 1911, he wandered into Rosedale and purchased a burial plot for himself at a cost of $135. Over time, he added a casket and vault. Then finally, for the same price as a modest house, he erected a 15-foot tall granite obelisk. Regularly over the next decade, Abel visited his future resting place. Cemetery staff recalled seeing him reading or eating lunch near his plot. Sometimes he would just stand there and admire the polished stone of his monument. He always kept to himself and never spoke to anyone, except on rare occasions to John Vanderloo. If he ever shared with him his reasons for living a solitary life, then it was another secret kept sacred by the faithful superintendent. When Abel Crawford died on March 14, 1922, he left specific instructions that there was to be no funeral, and the only witnesses allowed to attend his burial were the gravediggers. His final wishes were carried out to the letter, but it's not difficult to imagine that afterwards, the hand of John Vanderloo, his only friend, rested upon the monument to loneliness that Abel Crawford built for himself. There is a lonely section of Rosedale where a wanderer might notice a sudden change in atmosphere. Here the sun doesn't shine quite so bright. Birds do not sing, and the wind blows cold. When winter showers bring forth green growth everywhere else, here the earth does not yield. It is as if the ground has been poisoned by what was buried here in secret a long time ago. Of all the graves I have visited, none have made me look over my shoulder the way this one did. In 1921, the country was enthralled by the murder trial of Louise Pete. She was accused of killing retired Arizona miner Jacob Denton and forging his signature to drain his bank account. Denton mysteriously disappeared in June 1920, shortly after Louise began renting his 14-room house in Los Angeles. She concocted wild stories to explain his sudden absence, like that his arm had been severed during a fight with a sword-wielding attacker, and he was staying away until a suitable prosthesis could be made. Perhaps feeling the pressure from the inquiries about her landlord, Louise moved back with her estranged husband Richard in Colorado, with whom she had a 4-year-old daughter. A short time later, Jacob Denton's corpse was found buried in the basement of his home. He'd been shot through the head. After a 3-week trial, Louise Pete was given a life sentence. As she was being led to prison, her husband was by her side for strength, but it was she who had to comfort him. Despondent over their separation, Richard Pete checked into a hotel room and shot himself. Louise had a curious effect on the men who came into her snare. Richard was the 3rd husband to take his own life. In 1906, her first husband committed suicide after catching her with another man. Then in 1913, her second mate killed himself after Louise implicated him in the robbery of valuables from his place of employment. During her incarceration, Louise trusted the care of her daughter to her closest friend, Margaret Logan. Logan was convinced that Louise was innocent and lobbied for her release. Finally, in 1939, after serving 18 years of her life sentence, Louise was paroled. Back in society, Pete lived quietly for the next few years in the employment of her friend Margaret, who regularly signed her parole reports. Louise even found love again when she met retired banker Lee Judson. It seemed like her life was finally on the right track until 1944, when Margaret Logan went missing. The events that followed had an eerie resonance with the Denton case 24 years earlier. After Margaret's disappearance, Louise had her elderly husband, who was suffering from dementia, committed to an asylum, where he died a short time later. She told neighbors that he had disfigured his wife's face in an attack, and that she had gone away to have plastic surgery. At this time, the Department of Corrections noticed that Margaret's signature was being forged on Louise's parole reports and to cash checks at her bank. When they came to investigate, the body of Louise's benefactor was found buried near an avocado tree in her backyard, proving the old adage that no good deed goes unpunished. Louise explained that Margaret was murdered by her husband before he had been committed. She claimed to have buried her out of fear that, given her history, she would be blamed for the murder. Louise and Lee Judson, who by then was her 4th husband, were arrested. A jury of 11 women and 1 man didn't buy Louise's story, and she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Spouse Lee Judson was cleared of any wrongdoing and released. Afterwards, in keeping with the tradition of 3 prior husbands, he climbed to the 9th floor of an LA office building and leapt to his death. On April 11, 1947, Louise died in the gas chamber at San Quentin Prison. She was the 2nd woman to be executed by the state of California. her body was returned to Los Angeles and quietly buried somewhere near this spot where the grass doesn't grow. Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you enjoy these videos and are interested in becoming a sponsor, click the link in the description to go to my Patreon page. $1 per month will go a long way to bringing you more of these stories. And if you haven't already, please subscribe now for more grave explorations.